Hi guys, and welcome to this Houdini video tutorial. This is part 2 of the camera matching in Houdini series, and what we're going to do is now have a look at being able to prep this for rendering and eventually for compositing as well. So let's get started. We've kind of dove back into Houdini. What we did previously was we had set up our camera preferences to make sure that it matched the background plate. We also matched our camera position, our rotation, to the overall scene itself, and we're using an HDR image to light our scene. One last thing, I guess, is in general with HDRs, it can be good to give you an overall flow of the light itself, but you may actually want to drop in your own distant light or directional light to enhance the overall lighting of the scene itself. I'm just going to leave it as it is for now, but that might be a process that you want to consider. So let's go to our render view and just kind of see what we actually have here. So if I just hit render, it will generate the scene. Remember that we, in the camera view itself, turned off our backplate image, so we're just going to get the dragon itself. Ideally, this is what you want anyway, because we're going to use a compositing software like Nuke to rebuild our composite back together again. And you can see that we are picking up lighting information onto this diffuse material. To kind of make that painfully obvious, so I'm going to go to my material palette and we can drop in a few things. Firstly, I'm going to drop in a principled shader, and second of all, I'm going to drop in more of a metallic shader, which is still a principled shader at heart. It's just got different settings. So if we maybe drop in a aluminium into our material context, that'll give us some shaders to work with. And all I'm going to do is drag and drop our aluminium onto the actual dragon itself, and we can actually get to see what this looks like. So you'll notice that with the HDR, not only are we picking up lighting information, we're actually picking up information that would allow us to have reflection here as well. So that's really quite useful. So that would kind of be one part of our image. We've got our dragon. However, our dragon is actually sitting on, let's drop in our principled shader again. There we go. Sitting on a ground plane, and we're going to have some contact shadow for it to feel as though it's sitting in the plane. So let's show you how to kind of get that set up. I'm going to go to our object setup. We currently do have a grid in here, which is fine, and we're going to do a few things. Firstly, in our overall render, we need this grid to be rendered but not visible. The reason why we want it to be rendered is that there is going to be self-shadowing and reflection cast from the grid onto the dragon object itself. But visually, we don't want to see the grid. And there's a way that we can actually do that. If we go to our object setting, or out context, sorry, let's go to our mantra. This was the mantra that was created automatically when we went to our render view and hit render. So in our render settings, what we need to go to is actually objects. And what I'm also going to do is quickly override our camera resolution down to half, just so that any render tests that we're doing, it's going to be half resolution scale. So as I said, objects. First of all, we've got a lot of different fields here. At the minute, we've got this candidate objects star. What this means is that it can potentially render every single object. Whenever you see a star in Houdini, it means it's a wildcard and it means everything, okay? But we have the ability to kind of override what is actually being shown here in the display, because that wildcard is going to try and pick up everything, and based on whether or not it is displayed at the object level, that is what it's going to try and render. However, we can use forced objects, forced matte objects, forced phantom objects, and we can straight up exclude objects simply by naming them here in the render setting itself. And what we want to be able to do is have our object be visible in reflections and cast shadows, but not render out. And that specific tab is forced phantom. So what we want to do is select our grid as a forced phantom object. So although it is being displayed at object level, when we actually come here and say render to mplay, this will take a little while to kick up the first time, but here it comes. I'm just going to say allow. I have to type in my password for some reason. Okay. So here's his, it is actually rendering out, but only rendering out our dragon. However, down at the bottom, you can see that we're actually getting self-shadowing and reflection of the ground on the dragon itself. Just to make this clear, what I can do is I can turn off that forced phantom. I can go to my object level and turn off the visibility of the grid, and then just re-render this particular scene, and we'll be able to check out the difference between the two objects. So already you can see that there's quite a shading difference between image 1 and image 2 simply by the removal of that specific object. So you can see that is why we actually do want it to be there, but we don't want to be able to render it. So let's go back to our object, turn on our grid, go back to our out context, and in our mantra, let's tell it to be a forced phantom object. Now this can be for our beauty render. What we also want to get is our shadow cast render, and we can do this in a few different ways, but I'm going to show you a really nice, easy way to work. First of all, I'm going to duplicate our mantra by holding down Alt and clicking and dragging. There we go. And I'm going to rename this mantra to mantra shadow. And I'm going to erase out our forced phantom off the grid. Turn that off. I'm going to go to our object context, and we're going to create a secondary grid. That's going to be our shadow grid. So I'm going to, again, hold down Alt and left click and drag, and we get grid 2. And I'm going to rename this to grid shadow. What we want to do is assign this grid shadow object a specific material that's going to try and catch shadows and put it into an alpha. And there's a utility shader in our material palette. If we scroll down to the bottom, you can see that you've got a shadow matte material. So click and drag that in, and in our object context, we select our geometry, go to the render tab, and under material, let's pick out that material, shadow matte, and hit accept. Now for this to particularly work, we have added a new object, so our beauty render will have to ignore this grid shadow, and then in our shadow render we'll have to ignore our grid 1 because we don't want that to specifically be there, and we also want to make our dragon object a phantom. So let's fix our out context. Here's our beauty, and in the objects again we want to exclude the grid shadow because we don't want it to render specifically in this pass. We want it to render only in this mantra shadow pass. So for this we want to, this shadow mantra, what we want to exclude this time is the original grid, and we want to make our dragon cast shadows, but we don't actually want it to render out at all. So we can go to forced phantom and select our dragon and hit accept pattern. So let's show you what these two renders now look like. If I re-render our mantra beauty, we should end up with the exact same render as before, so we shouldn't see that ground plane because we've told it to be excluded from the render itself. So here comes our dragon, and it is being influenced by the original ground plane, so we're getting self-shadowing and coloring over the entire object. Good. And let's render out our mantra shadow now and hit render to end play. And it might be a little bit daunting because this object will render completely as black. However, what's more important is the alpha channel, and that is where our self-contact shadow of the object is actually going to be. You can see it's quite noisy because this is based on the lighting coming from the HDR light, or the environment light. And in our environment light, we don't have many samples to actually boost up its quality. If we actually give it some sampling quality of maybe like 3, and let's tell it to re-render, we should be able to get a finer degree of control over this particular render itself. We can also come in and work on our noise levels itself under our rendering and sampling tabs here. So at the minute we've not got a loss of pixel samples, we've not got a loss of refinement in noise. There's quite a lot that you can actually do to kind of tighten this itself, but this is going to give us our shadow pass to then utilize in our composite. So I hope this was kind of useful for you guys. We now have our original backplate image that we had already. We have our dragon object, and we also have our shadow pass for it to actually work itself. In the next one, I'll show you how to break down this particular object into AOVs and how to maybe create custom AOVs for you to export as well. So keep watching, and if you have any questions at all, please feel free to get in touch. I'll happily answer any questions that you have. Thanks.